Well, thanks for joining us here. If you would, let's just start with say your name, your branch of service, and dates of service.
Yep.
And we'll just kind of go from there.
Well, Larry Rip Rennie, anybody in the service knows me as Rip, not Larry. Anytime you go to a squadron, they give you a nickname, so that one's the one that stuck with me. I grew up just down the road, down I-35 in Gardner, Kansas, and had Navy airplanes flying over my head every day, and so it's like all my friends were Navy brats, so I was kind of destined to go that way. Uh, I well, I just uh, my my grandfather was a World War I vet. My dad was a World War II vet, and so I kind of completed the cycle with Vietnam, and so that's kind of my background and heritage. There is third or fourth generation Kansan.
So down there in Gardner, they have Navy aircraft down there too.
Well, that was all Navy aircraft out at what is New Horizons Airport. That used to be Olathe Naval Air Station.
Oh wow!
And they trained. It was an air base that was started up in World War II to train Navy pilots. One of the more renowned pilots that went through NAS Olathe was the Marine, the astronaut John Glenn, got his Navy Marine wings there at Olathe.
Really?
So anyhow, yeah, everybody that I knew, was connected to that base in one way or another.
So what year did you?
Oh, I went through the University of Kansas's NROTC program. So when I graduated there in '67, I got my ensign commission in the Navy and an aerospace engineering degree from Kansas. And through active and reserve duties, I was there and retired officially as a captain in '93. So about 26 years.
Yeah, it's a long time. Long time. So you didn't have to worry about the draft because you were doing ROTC. You had a plan to go in. So you joined '67.
Well, technically, when you join the NROTC, you're technically in, but your date of rank didn't start until you got your ensign rank there. So, so I was in '62 as a little third class midshipman there, and then kind of worked my way up both the Navy and the engineering school. So
You were commissioned in '67.
yes,
Correct. And then probably about '69 you hit fleet.
well, right after I graduated, I headed down to Pensacola with my shiny new Firebird with 4 on the floor that I bought with my good looks and credit, and got started in the the Navy aviation program, and graduated with my wings about a year later. I started in June, and by September of '68 had my wings, and then I was off to the fleet. So once you get your wings, then they determine whether you go into what squadron you go to. So if you're the top of your class, you get your pick. And of course, I wanted to go fighters. And so off to Miramar, California is where I ended up after getting my wings. And that back in those days, Miramar was known as Fighter Town, USA. That was where all the West Coast fighter squadrons were based. It's a great base and a great city to kind of do your active duty in.
So a year to get your wings, and then how long were you at Miramar?
Oh, I was there through 2 combat tours on the USS Ranger, 69, 70, and then again in 70, 71. The Ranger was based out of Alameda, California, so we would fly up, meet the ship in San Francisco, and off to Vietnam we would sail, usually with a stop in Hawaii on the way over to Yankee Station. Yankee Station was the place where the carriers all flew, and it was right in the middle of the Gulf of Tonkin there, just off in North Vietnam.
So I think I misunderstood. So when you went to Miramar, then you weren't in training anymore. That was where you were.
Well,
that was your assignment.
When you first get to Miramar, you're still technically in training for a little bit. There's a squadron there, VF 121. They call it it's the Ready Replacement Squadron there, or RAG or whatever. And that's where you learn to fly the F4. And once you kind of get checked out in the F4, then you're assigned to your fleet squadron. And my fleet squadron was VF-21. And on each carrier back in those days, they would have 2 fighter squadrons, and a carrier air wing. There would be 2 fighter squadrons, 2 A-7 squadrons, 1 A-6 squadron, and a tanker and ECM detachment, and then there would be 2 or 3 vigilantes that would be our photo and intelligence birds there. So,
What is ECM?
Electronic countermeasures. So most of the time the Garudas there, that was what their call sign was. Mainly they were our tankers. So the F-4s got to know the Garuda tankers very well. The F-4 was a notorious gas burner, and almost every flight we would go up and tank at least once. Sometimes we would tank going out to the target, and coming back from the target we'd have to tank again to make our hour and 45-minute cycle on the carrier.
And when you say tank, you mean like mid-flight refueling?
Yeah, in-flight refueling. So, off of Vietnam, every hour and 45 minutes, starting at noon and going to midnight, for 12 hours you were on. You either had the midnight to noon shift, or you had the noon to midnight shift. And right at midnight, or right at 12 noon, that's when the Ranger would start sending aircraft off the pointy end of the ship, and then at the end of the day, at 12 hours later, you recover the last flight, and they would hand that off to you. You had a sister carrier that was out there then that would take the next 12 hours.
What is the Ranger?
The Ranger is an aircraft carrier. It was CV 61. It was one of the big decks back in those days. Probably not quite as big as some of the decks today, but it was one of the bigger ones, and it was capable of handling the F-4s. So the F-4s all went on the bigger deck carriers.
Is that because it's a larger plane?
Yeah, larger plane,
Mm-hmm.
and the Ranger and the Kitty Hawk and the Constellation, all of those ships had stronger catapults and better arresting systems. In the F-4, you were taking off from the catapult. You were going from 0 to 65 knots, so 170 some miles per hour, and 150 feet. And when you landed back aboard, you were going from about 135 knots to 0 in 150 feet when you grabbed the wire. So it was quite a shot going off the pointy end, and quite a jolt when you grabbed that wire and came to a halt on the deck. So
when you say grab that wire, you mean like are you physically landing into a wire?
Yes, there's on the back of an aircraft carrier, there's four arresting wires back there, and that's the reason they call us Navy pilots tailhook pilots, because we fly with us tailhook down there to grab one of those wires. And every flight you're coming back and you're landing and you're grabbing, hopefully the 3-wire, that's the target wire that you try to hit each time. And we got very precise at our landings. This was something we prided ourselves on. And I know my squadron, there was always a contest among all the squadrons in the air wing. So each line period that every arrested landing you made was graded by an LSO, a landing signal officer. And in the old days, they were guys that were sitting back there with paddles that gave you instructions. In our day, they had the headset on and a mic, and they were talking to you, and they were telling you whether you were lined up properly, or if you needed a little more power, or you needed your nose was too high or too low. So the LSOs were there to provide a safe landing, but they also graded. Every landing you made was graded, and we had a board in our ready room. They would grade your hop, and so each landing, if it was an A-OK landing, then you got a green grade, and if it was just so-so, you got a yellow grade, and if it was a dangerous landing, you got a red grade. And most of the time, weather wasn't an issue, but if weather became an issue, then that was even more important for that LSO to talk you down. And of course, given that we were going from midnight to noon or noon to midnight, half of our flights were at night. So I proudly got a patch on my jacket here that says I'm a night centurion, which means I have over 100 landings at night, where I got most of my gray hairs. Those landings at night will, get your attention every time. So
I bet. What's that like?
Well, you're coming in, and the only thing you see on the side of in the back of the aircraft, on the back of the aircraft carrier, there's a datum light that kind of drops down from the ramp, and if it's off to the left or off to the right, that means you're not lined up properly. So that helps you with your lineup, and then you're looking outside the cockpit, and you're using power and your attitude to maintain an angle of attack that's optimum. And there's on the aircraft carrier itself is a datum light and a ball, a Fresnel lens, and the ball will go up and down. If the ball is above the datum lights, then you're high on glide slope. If you're below the datum lights, you're low. And if that ball ever drops to the last frame, it's red. That means you're about to hit the ramp, and you better put some power on, buddy, or you're going to bite it. So ramp strikes were to be avoided at all costs.
Yeah, it's pretty much a death stroke there, right?
Yeah. We always said that there was, in back of every carrier, there was a ramp monster ready to come and smite you into the back of the ship. So you just beware of the ramp monster, particularly on a dark ass night out there. It was scary. So most of those flights, we'd come back to the ship at night. You're under positive control. You're being given a radar-assisted approach to the ship, but you're flying and you're looking in the cockpit the whole time. Only when the LSO asks you to call the ball, that's when you look up, and that's about at 200 feet and a half a mile behind the ship, and then you bring it on in from there. But the landing sometimes it got pretty hairy. But at night, if you grabbed the wire, all was good there. If you did what you call boulder, it means you missed the wire. Sometimes you would fly a beautiful hop, but the tail hook would hit down on the deck and bounce up, and it missed the wire. And then there was a few expletives that you let out at that time, because that meant you were going to have to go around and do this whole thing again. And so
if you miss it, you take back off.
Yeah, you take back off. So yeah.
I was going to ask, what happens if you miss it? It seems like that's a significant part of the slowdown process.
So, as you're coming down, as soon as you hit down on the deck, you're going full power. And if you miss the wire, because you went to full power, you have enough to go around. It kind of becomes a touch and go or a boulder. So, but at night, then you have to go back out and get on the instruments again, and it was real easy to get vertigo, and there's a lot of pilots that augured in because they got vertigo and lost control. But you just had to be a very good instrument flyer, particularly at night and in bad weather.
So when you're coming in on that landing, you're increasing speed. So
No, you're trying
it's
to
at full power.
trying to keep your optimum speed usually was around 135 knots for an F4, but you try to keep that constant speed. You're not increasing speed. You're flying what they call an angle of attack. So you're trying to maintain a constant speed and a constant glide slope down to the carrier. So you do a GCA approach, ground control approach on any bad weather or all your night landings. So.
What was the primary mission of, were you and the F4 in general, or?
Well, the F4 was primarily was designed by the Navy to be an interceptor, to go out and protect the fleet, and every once in a while coming over from Hawaii, particularly between Hawaii and Subic Bay in the Philippines, we might be visited by a Russian Bear bomber would come out to greet us, and we would always have to launch some F4s and go out and fly wing on this Bear as it came in, made a pass over the ship and turned around and went back to the airfields up there in Vladivostok, I guess it is. Yeah. So, but if you want to, I've got some pictures of some of my buddies flying wing on a Bear, and the Bear bomber going full speed is maybe 230 knots, and an F4 at 230 knots is barely hanging in the air. So, flying wing on a Bear is kind of dicey. But the F4's main mission was to be fighter cover for the fleet, make sure that no MiGs came out to attack the fleet. We would always have every flight there would be at least 2 Phantoms, either from our squadron or our sister squadron, that would be up in the north end of the Tonkin Gulf, flying what they call a bar cap, a barrier cap, and our job was to intercept any bad guys that would come out towards the fleet. There was also some other airplanes that were out there flying in that airspace that we had to protect, some intelligence birds that the Air Force had up there and the like. So that was one of our missions. And then if we weren't flying a barrier cap, they were loading bombs on the F4, and we were going into mainly Laos. I've got a patch on one of my jackets there. It says Laotian Highway Patrol. Our job was to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail that kind of came out of North Vietnam, and it went down through Laos and into South Vietnam. So that trail, every other mission, you were going on a strike mission with bombs and trying to find some trucks or something to interdict the supplies coming down from the north.
And you were 12-hour shifts. So how many flights per day would that typically be?
Well, as in our squadron, you would either fly 2 flights a day, maybe 1 strike and 1 bar cap, and then you would have somewhere in the 24-hour cycle, you would have 2 hours on what they call the Alert 5. Now, even when the ship was down and we weren't doing the cyclic ops, we would always have 2 F4s sitting on the catapults ready to go within 5 minutes. They called it the Alert 5. So you were physically in the cockpit, strapped in, sitting there, ready to go. And those were always scary because you're usually not ready for the klaxon to go off to saying launch the Alert 5. that's an oh shit kind of a thing, particularly at night when you're trying to get some rest, and all of a sudden they're going, oh, they're going to launch our asses into this dark air. This is not fair. But they would do it anyway. So off we would go. And so sometimes you'd get a third flight, but that was kind of an unusual time. Usually you didn't have, when your ship was not conducting air ops, it was usually doing what they called an unrep. And for most people, they don't realize that when you're in a combat situation like we were in Vietnam, every day you've got a ship would come by, and the oiler would come by and give the Ranger its bulk fuel, its fuel oil that burned in its boilers. It would transfer over aviation JP5 for us to burn in our F4s. Maybe the next night there would be an ammunition ship that would come by, and here, as they're sailing along under the skies of Tonkin Gulf, here comes all these pallets of bombs over from that ship, and then maybe the third night there would be a resupply ship like the Camden, which would start sending over all of our, fresh supplies for the. You have 5,000 people on board an aircraft carrier. That's when the air wing's aboard and everything. So you got to feed 5,000 people 3 times a day. That's a lot of eggs, and they call it the logisticians call it beans, bullets, and black oil. And that was back in those days. Now the carriers are nuclear powered, so we don't have to give them gas, but you do have to, they have to have a tanker that gives them the fuel for the airplanes, and they still have to have the bombs and bullets. They have to come from someplace, and most people just don't realize that. Of course, that's not something that Hollywood's going to advertise in a Top Gun movie or anything, but I remember sitting up in the Alert 5 and I'm watching all this go on. There were some nights where you would have, on one side of the Ranger would be the ammunition ship, and on the other side would be maybe another supply ship, transferring stuff over. And of course, the most important thing every night was, all right, what are the new movies that are aboard? Because in every ready room at the end of flight ops, after 12 hours of blowing up things in Laos, we would always have a movie. And if you were the duty officer that day, your job, and that was your primary job, if you didn't get the best movie that could be gotten, then you were going to get dinged by the CO. So we made in Ready 6, which was VF-21's ready room, we had a ritual every night where right after the last plane had recovered, the CO would come in, plop down in his seat, which was up in the front row with the XO, and everybody had assigned seats in the ready room for the duty movie, and the CO would go, are we ready? And the duty officer would go, ready on the left. There would be somebody on the switch on the ready room door. There'd be another person on the projector in the back, and so after this ritual, it was like roll it, and so we had our squadron roll-ems there, which we would bend over backwards. Sometimes we would even, if we drew a short stall and got a movie that was a dud, we got to know the admiral's yeoman pretty well, and whatever the admiral, you knew the admiral was going to have a decent movie. So sometimes we would wait, and we would get the Admiral's movie. After the Admiral would see in the first reel, we would do what they called hot reel it. And we would grab the reel right off the Admiral's projector and down to our ready room, and we would put it on. So that would save the day for the duty officer some days, but yeah. But that was something to break the ice of the tedium of going on strike missions there every day.
Yeah.
And we would be off on Yankee Station usually 45 days. There was a couple of times that we were out there 60 plus days without a break. So that got a little scary.
Yeah. What was the typical loadout on the F4?
The F4, because we burn a lot of gas, we would always go with 2 wing tanks and 1 centerline fuel tank. So we would go with 3 external fuel tanks, and that would, if you nursed it just perfectly, you could make the hour and 45-minute cycle without going to the tanker. But that was a rarity. If you had a strike mission, in a strike flight, you were going to burn more gas, and so you were going to have to always tank at least once. When you went on a strike mission, you would carry usually 6 500-pound bombs. These were
Marketing twos?
Yeah, these were not smart bombs at all, just, yeah. And then we would have 2 Sidewinders, which is an infrared guided a missile, and then we would have 2 Sparrow missiles, which is our radar guided missile. So that was a typical loadout on a strike mission. Now, if we were going up on a bar cap, of course, they wouldn't load us up with any bombs. We would just have, we would maybe have an extra 2 Sparrow missiles. We'd have 4 Sparrow missiles and maybe 2 or 4 Sidewinders.
How do those radar guided missiles work?
Well, the F4J, which is what I flew, it had one of the best radars. It had a huge, I think they called it an AUG-9 radar, but it had a great range. It was a Doppler radar, which meant that we could look down into the clutter and we could pick out aircrafts that are coming in low. And so it was a great radar for picking up even the smallest enemy target. And if you were looking straight at a MiG-21, that was about the smallest profile you could get. And that AUG-9 radar was real good at picking them up. So once you locked on with your radar, then you had to close within, usually 5-6 miles there. You could launch a Sparrow at a bogey. Of course, the Sidewinder, you had to get around and go into usually to the back, and you would lock you would get a growl. If you had the seeker head from the infrared missile locked on the tailpipe of a jet, it would give you a nice loud growl, and that was good. That was a good signal, because once you loose that missile, that growl, that seeker head would lock right onto that heat source and stay with it, and you go fly, that Sidewinder would go right up the tailpipe of the bogey.
Did you ever have anything like that locked onto you?
Well, I did have a SAM missile shot at me one night. I did have, I was lucky enough, right at the very first part of our second tour, in November of '70, we had a mission. It was called Sante, and it was a POW camp that was just north of Hanoi, north and west of Hanoi a little bit. And the Navy provided the diversion. We were meant to cause all sorts of havoc, everything, so that the Vietnamese would look out towards the water at us. And coming through the back door, the Army Special Forces would come in with some Air Force helicopters and a couple of Air Force SPADs, and they came in from Thailand. So they'd come across Laos and into North Vietnamese from the backside. Unfortunately, they came in that night and they landed on an empty camp.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the POWs that were there had been moved about 2 weeks before we got there. So it was probably the Son Tay raid was the first time that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force all worked together on a mission. It went off pretty much without a hitch. I think the only casualty, if you could call it that, there was one Air Force Sandy or whatever they call him, one of the crewmen on the helicopter. He jumped off a little early off of his helicopter when they landed in the POW camp, and he broke his leg. And so that was the only casualty of the whole night was that fella. I came close. I guess I had a spot up there between Hanoi and Haiphong, which was the harbor, and I got early on in the night I got a SAM shot at me, which is always an attention getter. We had gear in our airplane that would tell you when the Vietnamese when the SAM radar was painting you, and then you knew when the SAM radar was locked on you, and then you knew when the missile was away. And when the missile was away, that was when you said, "Oh shit!" And you started playing. You had procedures that you learned that how to outfly that missile, and as the missile would approach, you would turn into the missile and shoot balls of chaff out in the air, and that would confuse their radar, and it would hopefully break lock on you and explode somewhere behind you. At least that was what they advertised. It worked for me, so I'm here.
We have at least one credible source, right?
Yeah.
Well, thankfully it did.
Yep.
Thankfully it did.
So that was the one time I got a SAM shot at me. I did have one occasion where my XO and I, we went, it was kind of a slow time in the air war there, where we weren't having a lot of activity, and we kept noticing that there was these two MiG-21s that would fly down from around Hanoi, bases up around Hanoi, down to a base that was outside of Vinh, which was kind of on the southern part of North Vietnam. And so the admiral decided that, by golly, we shouldn't let that go on unchallenged. So we laid in wait about 50 feet off the water out there until these MiGs started coming down one day, and then they loosed us on these two MiGs. And unfortunately, they turned around and started hightailing it north there before we could get to them. And so it was just a matter of time. Could we catch them before they got to this magic line that LBJ had painted there south of Hanoi? And unfortunately, we got to the line and had to break it off. So that was the one shot at getting a MiG there, but it didn't work out.
So in context, which is worse, night landing or evading a SAM?
Well, they're both hairy situations. I would say most night landings, if the boat's not pitching and the weather's decent, and you can come back on a nice moonlit night, and sometimes the moon was almost as bright as the sun, and you thought, oh, this is a piece of cake. But when it's overcast and there's no moon and it's raining like hell, those are night traps that would really get your attention. So, and if something bad was going to happen around the ship, it was probably a night mission. I had one where I was coming back from the ship, and my wingman wasn't able to clear the foul line in time, so I got a late wave off, and the next thing I know, my main mounts are touching down on the end of the angle deck, and the F4's nose is so heavy, the nose just went right on over. And when I saw 20 degrees nose down at the end of the angle, that was an automatic. So my Rio and we ejected out of the airplane. So that was one scary night. One minute you're flying an airplane, and the next minute you're, after fire and fury, you're hanging in a parachute going, well, I survived this much. But when my parachute popped, I'm looking right at flight deck level of the Rangers steaming right at me. So it was like, oh my. And I could see my Rio between the ship and myself. He ejected ahead of me, so he was coming down ahead of me. And according to the plane captain in the A7 that was parked up on the first catapult, Tony's parachute almost snagged the overrun for the catapult. So unfortunately, he landed in the bow wave probably of the ship. We never found my Rio. And there was just enough of a crosswind. We ejected on the port side of the ship, the left side, and there was just enough of a crosswind. When I landed in the water, I landed before the bow wave came. I'm trying to get the straps and everything off and tread water, and boy, the bow wave of something the size of the Ranger is huge. You could surf on it.
So to be clear, the bow wave is the wave that comes off of the ship, right?
Yeah. So it's like a big, you could surf on the bow wave most of the time. So when I kind of came back to the surface after I battled the bow wave, I'm about 10 feet. I was between here and there from the side of the ship going by me. The elevators were going over my head. If you want to feel insignificant, be treading water for everything you're worth and watching this huge chunk of metal go steaming by you. It's like, there's a hairy moment. Yeah. So when the ship passed, then the LSO always throws a flare in the water to kind of mark the spot where you ejected. And there's always a helicopter called the plane guard that's out there, and his job is to come pick up all aviators. That's when I got a new healthy respect for helicopter drivers that night. They found me in about 20 minutes and put a diver in the water, and it took the diver and I about 20 minutes to get untangled from my parachute. And then the helicopter lifts you out of the water. But it's I never really ever got to my life raft. When you eject, about 50 feet between you and the water, and you have to do a lot of things that were automatic. One of them is to pull a release on your seat pan, and that all your survivor gear deploys. And at the end of it is a little trip lever that blows up your little personal life raft. So after the ship passed, and then I saw the flare in the water, I saw between me and the flare this little life raft that had my name on it. So I just swam for all I'm worth, and I got my arm over the top of the
Oh, you got to it?
Yeah, I got to it, and it was like, I remember right before this particular mission, about 10 days before, I'd been in Hong Kong, and I just bought this brand new Seiko watch. And I remember looking at this watch and going, the time's going around. I'm going, took a licking and kept on ticking. I know it was a Timex, but this was a Seiko, and I still have that watch to this day. It's a reminder of that night.
It's still ticking?
It's still ticking.
Oh, wow. They say that's you get pretty beat up when you eject from the cockpit, right? Like,
well, the F4 had the ejection seat was a Martin Baker seat, which was actually a British design, and it had the F4J had that version of a Martin Baker seat had a cannon shell. It's like a 20 millimeter cannon shell that would shoot you out of the airplane to get you clear of the aircraft. And then it had a little bit of a rocket boost that would get you more altitude. In my case, the cannon shell got me clear of the aircraft, but the rocket seat boosted me out in front of the ship. So it got me far enough out there that I was able to survive. So I will give Martin Baker all their due, but it's hard on the back. To this day, I've had 3 lower back surgeries and 2 neck surgeries. So the VA figures it's because I ejected out of an airplane back in '71. So.
Yeah, they told us when you go through ejection seats in EOD school.
Yep.
And they told us that it was not uncommon for pilots to break bones when they ejected.
Here's the main thing was you try to position your head. If you had perfect timing, you would brace your back up against the back of the seat, and you would put your neck, align your neck straight with your spine, so that when that cannon shell hits you, everything would be aligned. If you happen to have your head down or off to one side or the other, it had been known to break necks of the pilot. And our headgear that we wore back then was actually pretty heavy. It weighed several pounds. So you put the typical flight helmet and all the G's that it put on your spine, getting you out of the aircraft, it could do major damage there. I suppose I said in the early days, I think backs were broken and necks were clearly broken. But most of the time it got you out and you lived to fight another day. So it took me 50 years to kind of get the results of that, but I kind of lived with a bad back most of my life, and a lot of that I put to that night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of damage, a lot of G-forces pushing out of that chair.
Well, in every carrier flight, when you're going a catapult shot, that's putting about 15 G's on your body as you're going down the catapult there, and anytime you're up in the airplane on a bombing run, pulling out at the bottom of a bombing run, you're pulling 4 or 5 G's, putting that on your back and your neck, and so there wasn't anything that you did in an F4 that didn't require pulling G's. Mm-hmm. In air combat maneuvering, you're pulling lots of G's trying to get on the back of another airplane flying ACM flights. We call those air combat maneuvering flights there. So,
tell us about these Top Gun hats you have here.
Well, I'd say that after my first cruise, I got called into the CO's office, and that's never a good thing when you get called to the CO's office. You think, okay, what did I screw up now? But he goes, well, this was when we were heading to Japan, right at the end. We just finished our last line period on Yankee Station, and we're heading up to Japan to come back home. So we're going to Yokosuka, Japan, and then Hawaii, and then back to Alameda. He says, I've got a deal for you, Rennie. There's this new school called Top Gun School, and we want you and Rio to go back early and get ready to, as soon as we get back home, we'll give you 2 of our F4s, and you can go spend 2 months going through this special training. And that was Top Gun School really got started back in 68, 69. So in 70, when I went through, I was one of the first classes to go through it. As I tell people, back when I went through, I didn't see any flight instructors that looked like Kelly McGillis. It just didn't happen. That's all Hollywood there. But some of the things in the movie were kind of authentic, but there's a lot of Hollywood in most of it. I just went to see the new new version of Top Gun Maverick, which is it's a great movie if anybody hasn't seen it, but it's the newer Navy F-18s, FA-18s they call them. Now we don't designate between fighters and attack. All the F-18s fly both the fighter and the attack role, just like we did in Vietnam. So they call them FA-18s. It was a great school. We learned how to it was a graduate school for fighter weapons, and it was how to fly and fight the F-4 properly. The big thing there was flying against dissimilar aircraft. We would go up and we would go dogfights with each other all the time, but that really wasn't a good test of your skills. You needed to go up against dissimilar aircraft that had different characteristics. So we would fly against A4s, F5s, and when I went through Top Gun, we even had a week when we flew against Air Force F-106s that came down from Montana. There was a whole squadron of F-106s that they got for our Top Gun school to go up against. So it was about learning how to properly fight your aircraft and win. It was kind of crazy. The F-4J didn't have any guns on it, so I always thought it was a misnomer that they called it Top Gun. They'd long since removed the guns from the F-4s, but it made us a better fighter pilot there going through this school. And when we went back to our fleet squadron, our job was to kind of impart that wisdom to the rest of the squadron back in those days. Now I think they try to rotate almost anybody that's been in an FA-18 slot through that school at some point in their career. But back then that was kind of special. So, and then when I got back from my second tour of Vietnam, I did a stint as a flight instructor in Pensacola. That kind of gets down to my second hat here. The Lexington was the aircraft carrier that they used in the Gulf of Mexico, where the students just going through flight training, this would be the first time they would go out and actually land aboard a carrier. And it was probably one of the neatest deals that we would have as a flight instructor. I taught air-to-air gunnery. We actually had a syllabus where we actually fired 50 caliber bullets at a banner and taught these young rookies how to put guns in bullets in a banner. But their graduation was when they went out to the carrier and got 6 day traps on the Lexington. So that was always a thrill, taking these young students out to the ship, and you would lead them out there, and this would be their first time they would actually land and trap aboard, then get a catapult shot off and come back around and do it again 6 times and come back, and boy, they were all stoked at the bar that night. So that was one part of my career was as a flight instructor. I was very honored to be named Flight Instructor of the Year in 1973 by VT4. I think they had hoped that by naming me flight instructor, they would get me to stay in, but I think the Vietnam War was winding down and they weren't going to give me the F-18s that I wanted, so I decided I would take my shiny new MBA that I just got, and I was going to get out and try my skills out in the business world. So I came up here to Kansas City and started working for Hallmark Cards in their treasury department. But I did stay with the reserves, and I would, once a month, sometimes twice a month, I would go down to Navy Memphis, and I'd fly A4s out of an A4 squadron that was down at Navy Memphis. And that was really, I was a fighter pilot on active duty. I was a flight instructor, but flying that A4 was great fun too. That was a great little aircraft, and there's an old A4 that's parked out at the park out at New Horizon Airport.
I've seen it.
Well, I've flown that one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as part of the CAF, we were tasked with cleaning it there once a year. So as we're out there, I found out kind of where that came from, and when I found out it came from Navy Memphis, I looked at my logbook, and sure enough, that tail number is in my logbook. So
That's awesome.
so anyhow, when that squadron, unfortunately, was moved from Navy Memphis all the way down to New Orleans, that was just not a commute that I could make, and so I decided to take my career a different direction. So I moved to Pittsburgh, PA, and went out to the Reserve Center there, and the only aviation billet they had in the whole Reserve Center was a lieutenant commander slot at Cincus Navur, Commander Naval Forces Europe. And that was actually awful tough duty, because we had to go on active duty to London, England, and go to the staff there and provide services for different drills that we would have there at Cincus Navur. Part of the deal for that was I had to change my MOS, which is my specialty as a driver of airplanes. That's one specialty, but I had to get a new specialty now to become to get my N54 designation. I had to get this planning MOS, so I had to get a tour to the Navy War College, where I got I made a course there called the Policy and Plans course, and that got me my MOS. So I became a planner for all the war plans that the Navy had for North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So that was a whole different kettle of fish there.
Mm-hmm.
You had to look at things completely different. You had to understand order of battle that was that what our Red Forces would have, i.e., the Soviet Union in those days, and so I'm clearly a product of the Cold War. We would every exercise we'd go over, we would try to take some part of our battle plans and game it out to see, what holes we could poke in it and the like. Sometimes we would take the plans to back to the War College. I did this at least once, where we would spend 2 or 3 weeks at the War College going through playing war games, global war games. So that was very interesting there. You were there with some of you would have people from our allies like the Brits and the Dutch, and they'd all show up, and we'd go through these war plans. We would have somebody that would play the president, and another guy would be the Secretary of Defense, and we'd go through all of the game as if it was actually going down there, and that was interesting to kind of see how those played out. So
Yeah, I can imagine.
I had one time I was sitting down at the morning brief there, and this short, fat guy kind of plopped down on the seat beside me, and he didn't look like he fit the mold of a military type. And I did a double take, and I'm going, you wouldn't be Tom Clancy by any, and it was.
Really?
He had been granted special permission to sit in, and he was doing research for, if anybody's a Tom Clancy fan, he did one book called Red Storm Rising.
I've heard of
And
it.
it was about the Third World War. And that's what we were playing in this war game, was the Third World War. So he was doing some research for his book.
Interesting.
Always wondered how he got the good stuff in his book, but
I'm gonna have to go back and read that now. I can't remember if I've seen it or not, or read it or not.
Red Storm Rising is the name of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it, and I almost think I read it, but I'm gonna go back and reread it now. It puts a different context.
Yeah.
You know, that's kind of neat. So during this whole time, are you married during service, or
I am.
kids?
Yep.
And
Married to Carol Harms. I met her while I was going through the University of Kansas there. Actually, met her on a ski trip in Colorado. So, we got married after when I was going through the training command, after she had finished her school. Later that year in '67 there, we got married over my Christmas break there. So December 27th. So she's been with me ever since, 50-some years. So we hung in together. She's been there through thick and thin. She probably wasn't thrilled with me when I told her I came home early and told her I was going to go promptly to Top Gun school there. But and all that time that I spent in the reserves, she probably wasn't all that happy. But now that I'm drawing a retirement pay from the Navy as a captain, that seems to work pretty well nowadays. So,
Yeah.
so all's well. So, she's been great about my military career, and I've tried to include her in a lot of things. When I had active duty in Norfolk, a couple of times I've taken her and my daughter there to Norfolk, Virginia there, and there's plenty to do around there, and I was off to work each day. When I finished with my career in Pittsburgh, I moved back here to Kansas City, and the only billet that they had for me in Kansas City was a NATO billet. So one of the other things that I got to do is the last 3 years I became a NATO officer.
oh no, wow! So that's
And
pretty-
got to go to the NATO Senior Officer School in Oberammergau, Germany. So that was a neat school, but you're there with all your NATO, all the other NATO officers there that are kind of new to NATO, and it was also about the time when the Berlin Wall was starting to come down. So there was some celebrations there in Germany there about how we maybe had won the Cold War, but as we know now that we still have Russia as it may not be the Soviet Union, but it's metastasized and it's come back as Russia, and unfortunately Vladimir, he decides he wants Russia to look like the old Soviet Union. So
yeah, same
Yep.
problem, different name.
different name. So anyhow, I was pretty proud of being able to work with the NATO folks there for a while, and that's totally cool to go on an exercise. And I remember one I went to in Oeiras, Portugal, where we had the British. I worked for a British admiral who was running the show, and I had two NATO AWACS birds. Those are the big E3s that have the dome on top. I ran the air desk there for this exercise. We had Brits coming out of Britain playing. We had a French carrier that came down, the Clemenceau. We had the Spanish. It was Spanish that just joined NATO, so they wanted to come and play. So they dusted off their brand new. I think they had new Navy F-18s that they were wanting to show off what their capabilities were. So we had a war game off of Spain and Portugal there for a couple of weeks. So, but working with your NATO allies, I remember flying on that NATO AWACS bird one day. I conned a couple, since I was the air desk manager, I said, I want to go see this from the air. So I went up in the airplane, and in the cockpit up there, you'd have an Air Force major flying it. You'd have a German co-pilot. You'd have a Dutch navigator. You would have back in the back, there would be another Air Force major. That would be the TACO, the Tactical Air Coordinator. He kind of runs the whole big picture. And then in each of the scopes back there would be, one guy would be Portuguese, the next guy would be German or Brit or Dutch. It was like this airplane was just had something from almost every NATO country.
And of course, they all speak like 8 languages apiece. So
yeah, they do. But on the plane, it was English. On the brief each morning, the French made you, since they came to play, we had to do part of the brief each morning in French, and then the rest of the brief in English. That was as something we had to endure for the French.
I'm not surprised by that.
So, but yeah, it was interesting exercise. And then some other exercises. I did some work with the Brits at their Northwood Command Center, which is where the Royal Navy has their bunker out in the western suburbs of London. So I had some interesting times. Probably the last part of that exercise, everything got canceled because everybody was about to go to. This was just after 9/11, and so we were about to go on Desert Storm, I guess it was, and so everybody, the exercises all got canceled, and so I went to the admiral. I said, "Well, where can I be of most help?" And they sent me out to a Navy Commodore who was the head of the Military Sea Lift Command, and I helped him get his. He had a staff of like one other person, and all his staff that was coming in to help him track all these ships were all reservists. So I put together his duty watch stations, and we got all of his reserves kind of in and getting them up to speed on their jobs. And at one point we had, I think, 113 ships that we were tracking from East Coast ports that were going through the Mediterranean and down through the Suez Canal and up into Saudi Arabia, and this was all to liberate Kuwait. So so that was an interesting little project. I got involved in for a time. So
was this set? And that was before. So as a reserves, yeah, you were still in.
I was on active duty for just it so happened that when the flag went up there, and I remember as we had commandeered, the U.S. Navy had commandeered all these. We weren't going to let the Soviet flagships carry any of our gear, so we got any NATO ally that had a good transport to under contract for the Navy, and then the Brits decided that they were going to join the fight. This was back in Margaret Thatcher's day, and so then we had to divvy up some of our ships that we had commandeered so that we could get all of the British stuff over to Saudi Arabia. People don't realize the logistics of what it took to get all that crud over there, all those tanks and all those vehicles and everything.
For sure, I was in the second invasion.
Were you?
03,
yeah.
So yeah, it is a process.
Yes, it is, and and a lot of that stuff that you Army guys had was just too big to fly in airplanes. You had to, I don't know. I think maybe we might have been able to get one Abram tank or something in a C-5A or maybe two, but you can't get there that way. So we brought most of the gear on Navy ships.
Yeah, we put all our stuff on ships when we went over there.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So
what was it like? Well, you didn't answer if you guys had kids.
oh yeah, I've got one daughter, Tiffany, who's she's now living with us, and I have got one grandson, Zachary, and he's a fourth, soon to be a fifth grader. Of course, he likes everything aviation, so I try to, hopefully I'll instill a little bit of that in him there. But we've enjoyed going. Like last summer, we went out to the big air show out at New Horizon there, and that was great seeing the Blue Angels fly, and he got to meet some Blue Angels, and I think his highlight was going to see this A-10 Warthog that was parked there. As we're walking by it, he goes, "Poppy, is that a Gatling gun?" I'm going, "Yep, it sure is." So I hoisted him up there so he could take a look at the business end of a Gatling gun. So, but yeah, we have a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun with him. He's a great one, and I'm very blessed to have, as I say, have a daughter and grandson here with us, and we're a three generational family right now. So,
how do you feel your time in Vietnam and service as a whole impacted you as like a father and a husband and things like that? I mean, just the nature of being deployed all the time is
yeah.
stressful.
Well, I was going to say it. Being deployed all the time would be tough, and I was not. I didn't have my daughter until after I got out and was back here in Kansas City. But so I was flying with the reserves. So to keep your hours and to keep current with the reserves, I mean, taking it, 2 days out of every month at least at a minimum, and 2 weeks sometime during the summer or whatever to go on active duty. That put a strain on the family sometimes. But I think in the end it's worked out for everybody. I think my wife would say that.
It helps. I think it probably helps too that you had your daughter after the active duty period.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Yeah.
What was correspondence with your wife like when you were in Vietnam?
Oh yeah. Well, back in those days, of course, we didn't have the internet or any of that. So when we were out on the line, it was just writing letters, and we would correspond that way. Sometimes we would do a little tape, but cassette tapes, that was big back then. And when we get into port there in the Philippines, I would usually get at least one phone call from the Philippines to wherever my wife was. First cruise, she went back to Kansas City after I left and spent her time there. And second cruise, she stayed in San Diego there with the squadron and the wives, and they kept busy doing all sorts of things that the girls do. But and of course, they were all ready and waiting for us when we came back home. We had a big fly-in there. It was like we tried to do our best Blue Angel formation as we came roaring over Miramar there. It'd be about 12 airplanes in a gaggle. So, yeah.
What was the craziest thing or most standout thing that would you say from your time in service?
Well, it kind of depends on kind of which side. Obviously the honor of going to Top Gun school, that was a big honor. Just just surviving 2 combat tours in Vietnam, flying off the aircraft carrier at night. That's those were attention getters. All of those flights, and but as I say, my second career was completely different there in the Navy. But being a reservist, it did allow me to have a civilian career too. So I was blessed with a great career as an investment banker, first with Mellon Bank, and then with State Street, and then with U.S. Swiss Bank Corp, UBS. So had that career also. So it's made for a comfortable retirement here. So very, very happy with that.
It's awesome. Yeah, being able to have a side-by-side career while finishing out your retirement's definitely an advantage.
Yep. And of course, I retired from the Navy in '93, so I still continued on with my civilian career until only about 10 years ago, something like that. So
maybe added for a little more of a gradual transition.
Yep, it did. It did. So
yeah. We feel like there's anything we left out?
Not really. As I say, in terms of kind of the one mission, that mission trying to go in and rescue the POWs, that was probably my the capstone in terms of my mission. I did get a Navy Commendation Medal for that. Probably would have been more if we'd have rescued some POWs, but that's the way it works sometimes. And if I'd have bagged a MiG on that flight that we chased MiGs, that would have been another medal, but that was not to be. So sometimes you just kind of have to take what you get. So,
well, you got all your pieces. That's an award right there.
There you go. Yep. So it's been an honor to be part of the Navy, and I just wish people would recognize that the Navy does have an Air Corps, and we are not Air Force. We're Navy, and so.
Well, they got to release a movie about every 30, 40 years.
Yeah, every 30, 40 years, just to remind people. That's it. Exactly. And it's not bad having Tom Cruise as a spokesman for you there.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
I want to ask about what did you think of the new one? We talked a little bit about it.
Well, it was probably as much about a strike flight, delivering bombs on a target, as it was about air combat. It kind of weaved both of those stories together. The first one was all about flying against another aircraft, where this one is all it kind of blends in both what we did on the strike side as well as the air combat side.
Can we? So you got the jacket behind you.
Yep.
Can you watch the mic? But if you can, just kind of pull it over, and so we can get some shots of the patches and all that.
Oh yeah.
Yep. Well, probably right here in front is that's the Top Gun patch right there.
Recognize that.
And then some of us called ourselves Yankee Air Pirates. On the back here, of course, the Phantom Flyer. That's the F4. This is my 100 combat missions patch. This was having 100 landings on the Ranger. This was the Ranger's patch. Let's see, what was this? Just U.S. Navy, and this is VF-21, the Freelancers. So we were out of Navy Miramar. So. I would have brought her along. You have two jackets. This is kind of the more formal one. There's a green jacket that normally you have. I tried it on, but it shrunk or I got bigger. So it has some of the same patches, but some other ones there. But I was going to wear it, and it was like, nope, just can't get that one on. So.
And you got the Phantom shirt there.
Yep. Of course, it was in its day. It was the fastest thing on wings there. One of the things that they let you do, and of course, there's a little bit of this in the Top Gun Maverick movie, is the F4 had the capability of doing better than Mach 2. So there was, as you were going through your flight training in the F4, they would give you a clean airplane one day, and you'd go off, and they would let you take it up to Mach 2. So I've got a Mach 2 pin that not too many people can say they've been twice the speed of sound. But that's
Wow.
In this latest movie, Tom Cruise is doing Mach 10. So,
Is that a thing?
I don't know. I think it's a Hollywood thing.
I'm going to Google it now.
So no reason to be going that fast.
That's fast.
I'm gonna ask you. So you mentioned, so it was Desert Storm. So that was in '91. Right?
Yep.
I mean, that was a while before. You mentioned 9/11, but you mean Desert Shield, Desert Storm, right? 91.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think at that time they had the F-18 and F-14s. I think F-14s were still flying.
F-14s were still flying then, yeah, in the early days. Yep, that was a hot airplane at that time. It had the wings that actually went out for landing and then folded back there for supersonic flight. It was a cool design, but it was a little hard to maintain, I think. So as time went on, they migrated to everything to the FA-18s. So. And they moved. The saddest thing was they took all the fighters out of Miramar and moved them up to Lemoore. Took the fighter weapons school, the Top Gun school, and moved it to Fallon, Nevada, and gave the Miramar to the Marines. So it's a Marine base now.
So what was your favorite plane of all the planes what was your favorite to handle?
Well, yeah, the F4, when flown correctly, it was a handful. I mean, when you went around the detent and you went into afterburner, I mean, it would sit you back in the seat and you would be going supersonic before you knew it. But in terms of just plain fun, the A4 that I flew in Memphis was about as much fun. The A4 the cockpit is so small, when you get into it, you kind of become one with the airplane. So when you put that canopy down, it's like it's like kind of the difference between a sports car and riding a motorcycle. Oh, that was one story I was going to tell you about when we were coming back from Vietnam. That second time, we were, as I say, the first time we were going through Yokosuka. We got the opportunity, if we wanted to buy a motorcycle in Japan, and they would bring it on board and they would put it on the hangar deck, and so we all bought these motorcycles, Kawasaki's and Hondas and the like, and bought them dirt cheap in Japan. And but when we got home, I remember we had all these motorcycles delivered to my garage, since I was the only one that still we had a garage down there, and so there was about 5 of us that had our motorcycles that we had to put together and try to read a manual in Japanese to how to hook up the headlights and how to do this and that. But we got all these motorcycles together and took them down and got them certified to run on the roads of California. So, but yes, it was a thing, riding out to Miramar there on our motorcycles.
That's awesome.
I've been known to do that. And of course, every Tom Cruise movie, he has to be going on a motorcycle out there.
But at least we know there's some historical context
There is some
right?
context to it there.
Yeah.
We brought back about 700 motorcycles from that one trip there. And the CO of the Rangers said, "Now, guys, I'll put these motorcycles all in the hangar bay, but if we have to go to war between Japan and Alameda, then all of them are going over the side." So it's like, okay. We didn't think we thought that was pretty good odds that we'd get our motorcycles at the end of the day. So
It worked out.
yeah, it worked out. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's awesome. But I don't have anything else. Yeah, wrap it up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you.